In June 2003, a brutal crime shocked a small town in France. A 9-year-old girl was assaulted and beaten to death. The police quickly caught the suspect and convicted him. But to everyone's surprise, a year after the man was imprisoned, the victim's own father began fighting to clear the murderer's name. Why would a grieving father try to free his daughter's killer? The story keeps twisting again and again. Until the very end, you'll never guess who the real murderer is. The main character, Richard, was a seasoned detective, and his wife Claire worked as an anesthetist at a hospital. Both were always busy, leaving their 9-year-old daughter Annie often alone at home. One ordinary weekend, Claire had to work overtime, and Richard, finally with some time off, decided to take Annie out for the day. But before they could leave, Richard got an urgent call from his boss, ordering him to return to the station immediately. With no other choice, Richard told Annie to stay home again. After he left, Annie, bored and lonely, called a friend to hang out. But her friend waited at their meeting spot for a long time, and Annie never showed up. Meanwhile, Richard finished his work and rushed home, but Annie wasn't there. Assuming she was out playing with friends, he didn't think much of it until his colleague called to tell him a girl's body had been found in the woods near his house. The victim was his 9-year-old daughter, Annie. She had been assaulted and beaten to death. Determined to catch the monster responsible, the police mobilized every available officer and eventually arrested a suspect named Ekman, a polite-looking middle-aged man with glasses. During interrogation, Ekman admitted he had been to the woods that day but denied killing Annie. With no witnesses, fingerprints, or hair samples to tie him to the crime, the police resorted to long, intense questioning, hoping to break him down. Finally, under pressure, Ekman confessed to killing Annie. With his confession in hand, the prosecution quickly filed charges. But during the trial, Ekman suddenly retracted his confession, accusing the police of coercing him. His defense lawyer argued that the officers handling the case were all colleagues of the victim's father, and they might have rushed the investigation and used force to get a confession. Moreover, the police had no physical evidence, no DNA, no forensic proof to show Ekman was the killer. Despite their arguments, the crime was so horrific, and Ekman's confession included details only the killer could know, that the judge and jury found him guilty of rape and murder. Since the country had no death penalty, Ekman was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The case seemed closed, but soon after being imprisoned, Ekman sent Richard a letter. In it, he earnestly claimed he wasn't Annie's killer. He said his life had already been miserable, so being wrongfully convicted didn't matter to him. But what terrified him was that the real killer was still free and could harm more innocent children. Ekman begged Richard not to stop investigating until the real murderer was caught. Richard initially dismissed the letter, thinking Ekman was just trying to play innocent. But a year later, while driving on duty, Richard heard a radio report. Police in a nearby district had just arrested a serial killer named John. This man had traveled across the country for years, targeting lone children. Over the past decade, many young victims had died at his hands. Hearing this, Richard suddenly remembered Ekman's letters. For the past year, Ekman had been sending him letters every few months, repeating his innocence and warning that the real killer might strike again. Now, Richard started to wonder, what if Ekman was telling the truth? To find out if the newly captured John was connected to Annie's death, Richard got permission from his superior to review the case files. He soon discovered disturbing similarities. John's victims had all died in the same brutal manner as Annie. Even more suspicious, John had a head injury that caused memory lapses and confusion. In one of his statements, he described details of a murder that didn't match any of his known victims, but perfectly matched the circumstances of Annie's case. Richard also learned that John's cousin lived near the forest where Annie was killed. According to records, John had suffered severe abuse from his father growing up, leaving him with lasting head trauma. He needed medication to manage headaches and memory problems. Around the time Annie was murdered, 2 years earlier, John had been staying at his cousin's home nearby. A local road was under construction then, and John was working part-time on the crew. His cousin had even booked him an appointment with a neurologist the same day Annie was killed. That meant John had indeed been in the area when the crime happened. Richard later contacted members of that construction crew. Their supervisor told him something crucial. On the day of the murder, John had been assigned to drive a truck to the landfill to dump debris, a route that passed right by the woods where Annie was found. The timing matched almost perfectly with Annie's death. All evidence pointed to John as the real killer. At Richard's request, police interrogated John again, showing him Annie's photo. John insisted he had never seen the girl and denied killing her. He admitted driving past the woods that day, but said he never stopped and didn't know about any murder. Even though John refused to confess, Richard's doubts didn't fade. His reasoning was simple. John's head injury caused serious memory problems. Maybe he had killed Annie, but had already forgotten everything he did. That night, Richard wrote back to Ekman in prison for the first time, laying out his recent investigative progress and saying he now believed John was the true killer of Annie, though he still lacked the decisive evidence. If they could find an eyewitness, they might prove John's guilt and clear Ekman after 2 years of wrongful imprisonment. When Ekman received the letter, letter, relief washed over his face. He pulled out a stack of envelopes and chose a fan's address. After the arrest, many strangers, attracted by his polite demeanor and the lack of hard evidence, had written Ekman letters of support, urging him not to give up. Richard's reply made Ekman hope for freedom, so he wrote back to one devoted female fan, thanked her for her encouragement, and told her his case might be reopened. He had his lawyer send the letter. Meanwhile, Richard formally asked his superiors to reopen Annie's case, but they refused, preferring to let the original verdict stand rather than embarrass the police. Frustrated, Richard continued the probe alone. He tracked down the neurologist who had treated John and confirmed John's headaches and memory lapses, and, out of sympathy, against professional ethics, the doctor gave Richard John's full medical records to help determine whether John might really be the killer. Richard also persuaded a TV reporter friend to run a public appeal for witnesses. Claire, seeing the program and the correspondence with Ekman, was furious that her husband seemed to be helping her daughter's convicted killer, and Richard's boss was equally angry at his unilateral actions. Richard answered both by saying he could not let hatred blind him. He was a father who wanted the real killer caught, but also a policeman who could not knowingly leave an innocent man imprisoned. The broadcast paid off. A curly-haired jogger called in and said that on the day of the crime she had run near the woods and seen a man come out of the trees. Her description and the timing pointed to John, and with that testimony, Annie's case was reopened. In court, John still denied ever being in the woods or killing Annie, but given his memory problems and the independent eyewitness account, the jury convicted John and cleared Ekman, who was released and awarded 200,000 euros in compensation. But the plot twisted again. Before Ekman left prison, he had secretly rifled his wardrobe and found a hidden letter, the very first letter he had ever written to Richard, which contained a full, detailed confession of how Ekman had assaulted and murdered Annie. In fact, Ekman was the true killer, and Richard's efforts had, tragically, helped free the real murderer. Even worse, Annie was not Ekman's only victim. He had killed at least 2 other girls. The perverse truth was that Ekman had originally written a taunting confession, but then changed course, hiding that letter, and repeatedly writing pleas of innocence to Richard in order to torment the bereaved father and win his trust, thereby creating a chance for a retrial. Ekman also manipulated his fan to provide false testimony. She had given a fake name and address, so authorities never connected her to Ekman before the trial. Satisfied with his deception, Ekman literally chewed up the incriminating confession and swallowed it with a hideous smile. After his release, he met the curly-haired witness, coerced her into handing over all their correspondence, burned the letters, and then went to Richard's house, more proud, apparently, of duping Richard into freeing him than of the murders themselves. Richard pretended to accept Ekman's grief, invited him to drink, then quietly drugged the wine. Ekman collapsed. When he came to, he was bound and transported to the very woods where Annie had been killed. Richard had learned from John's medical records that John suffered from a congenital male sexual dysfunction that would have made it impossible for him to have sex with a woman, him to sexually assault victims before killing them. John never disclosed this shame, perhaps to protect his pride, but after Ekman's endless petitions, Richard decided to turn the tables, use John's arrest to get Ekman out, then execute the remorseless monster himself. Ekman, who had believed he had manipulated Richard, instead became the hunted, and when he realized he was the prey, he was soon buried alive where Annie had died. News reports later suggested Ekman had vanished to start a new life with his compensation money, but Claire and Richard's commander, seeing the coverage, finally understood Richard's grim strategy and the depths of his motive. In a country without the death penalty, the justice system can be powerless against truly monstrous criminals. Do you think what this father did was right? Leave your thoughts in the comments.